Good evening. I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome to Conversations in the Digital Age. With us tonight is Roxana Robinson. Roxana Robinson is an author, a novelist. She has written 5 novels. Her latest novel, which is entitled Sparta, is just a thriller. I couldn't put it down. It is a book about a young man's return from Iraq after a 4-year tour of duty in the Marine Corps, and his difficulties in reintegrating into civilian life, particularly in that he has post-traumatic stress syndrome as a result of his wartime experience. Roxana, we're delighted to have you with us. Congratulations on your book. It really was a wonderful read.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So now, have you always written novels, or you've written 5, but were you doing nonfiction before that?
I had a kind of an awkward entrance into the writing world. I've always written. I wrote in high school, I wrote in college, I wrote when I got out, but for day jobs, I did lots of other things, and then I went into the art world. So I entered the art world, became really interested in American art and American painting, and I started writing about that before I could get my fiction published. Then when I started getting my fiction published, I thought I would leave the art world, but I actually wrote one more book, the biography of Georgia O'Keeffe. And then I left the art world and started doing just fiction. So I wrote 3 collections of short stories and 5 novels.
The last one is the only one I've read. I plan to read others, and I think it's just amazing. But you've written about addiction, you've written about divorce, you've written about the environment, and now you're writing about war, particularly the Iraq War. Is there any overarching theme to all this, or are you just going from subject to subject?
I didn't start out thinking that there was an overarching theme, but I realized when somebody, there was a college professor who said she wanted to teach a course of my work, and could I describe the three novels before this one, and I realized that I was really writing about a sense of entitlement, and that's in this book too, and it's kind of a national presence, this notion of our feeling that we can do whatever we want. It's part of the American philosophy that there's always, you can have a dream, you can do whatever you want. And This Is My Daughter, which is about divorce, there was a notion that seemed to prevail, which was that you can always fix things, you can always move on, you can get divorced, you can get remarried, you can remake your life, you can start over.
The universe will provide.
Yeah, and with divorce, it doesn't work that way. If you destroy a marriage and a family, you can never put it back together the way it was originally. You can never remake a marriage and a family. So it was about exploring that notion of possibility and the fact that it was founded on a false premise. And then Sweetwater was about the environment, and again, that came out in 2003, and I was working with this notion. I think things have changed since then, but at that time there was this notion that the earth was infinitely restorable, infinitely bountiful, and we could do anything and it would still go on being the same bountiful presence, which isn't true. We run the risk of really destroying it. So again, there was this sense of possibility and entitlement, and we could do whatever we wanted. And with Cost, which is about heroin addiction, I didn't start out to write a book about heroin addiction. It was a digression, which took over the book, but it was originally...
You became addicted along the line.
Yes, I did. I stumbled into it, and it took over the book. But it was originally about the notion of being sort of in the middle of your family and having aging parents and having grown children and being in the middle and feeling as though, again, there's this sense of the American dream. That's when you live your own life unfettered by other responsibilities. That turns out not to be true. You always have responsibilities, especially if you're a woman. Your children are always your children. Your parents, no matter how robust they seem, are going to fail, and you are responsible for taking care of them. So there's this sense of struggling to free yourself of sort of the risks and responsibilities of being alive, and then finding that you never do. You never do. You're always strung up in that. And then Iraq was about...
well, was there a tectonic shift when you started to write about war and write about a man and not really about a woman, although there is a woman, several women characters, but the one who is most finely drawn is, of course, the protagonist, Conrad, and is a man. So does this represent a shift in your conception?
I've actually written often in men's voices before. In Cost, I write in the voices of the aging grandfather and the two sons. So I write in three men's voices. And in This Is My Daughter, a third of the book is the husband, the father's voice. So it wasn't the first time I'd written in a man's voice. It was certainly the entry into the world of war and the world of military was a huge shift for me, and that was something I really knew nothing about. I was raised a Quaker, so I came from a completely non-military background. I hardly knew anyone who'd ever been in the military. So to investigate this world, to find out...
So you were like Conrad's parents.
I was. I knew nothing about it, and I sort of shrank from it.
But you write about it in meticulous detail. I've been reading your book. I thought I was there in the trenches of Quantico, Virginia, or on the roads of Iraq. I mean, how did you find out about all this?
Once I became interested, I just was completely riveted by it. I spent 5 years doing researching and writing this book. And during that 5 years, I just thought continually about the Marines and about the training, and I watched the videos of the training camps, and I found somebody who would take me to Quantico. I befriended Marines. I watched videos. I talked to vets, as many.
Did you go to Iraq?
I was dying to. We were at war while I was writing the book, and it was very difficult to get there.
Well, you could have been embedded.
I don't think they would have taken
a novelist?
Novelists have no street cred, but there was one trip that was an archaeological trip that was to the northwestern part of Iraq in the final stages of my writing the book, and I was so tempted to go, but it was a very dangerous part of Iraq, and as an American, you really are at risk, so I ended up not going.
So the book is called Sparta, and Sparta is, of course, a place in ancient history. It was a city-state, but as I read the book, it's also a metaphor. Could you explain?
I became fascinated by the Marines on many levels, but one of them was their philosophical...
What woman would not be fascinated by the Marines?
I guess that's right. It's a very interesting culture, and one of the interesting aspects of it is its philosophical and historical link to the ancient world, and particularly Sparta. And Marines feel very close to Sparta, and they use it as a name. They name their outposts, their battle outposts, Sparta. They name their groups Sparta. They use Sparta as an adjective, and this stripe of red on the dress uniform is called Spartan red. So they have a very strong feeling of connection, and the more I read about Sparta, the more I realized both the strengths and the severe drawbacks of that kind of culture that really embodies the great martial virtues of courage and loyalty and committedness, but you can't have a society that is only based on martial virtues. It dies from within. And so the risk is that you base too much of the culture's promise on those virtues, and then you lose the whole man.
I mean, it was the camp in Iraq where Conrad is billeted is called Sparta, Camp Sparta. Is there a real Camp Sparta in the Marine Corps?
There are lots of them.
Where is it located?
But the one I was talking about, the incident that took place in Haditha in 2005 actually happened. All that is based on a real incident, and the outpost was called Sparta.
Now, Conrad encounters a horrific experience in his 4-year tour of duty. And I gather as you've drawn the plot, he doesn't have any leave time at home. One isn't aware that he did. I don't know whether it would be common for him to have that or not. But in any event, he's there in Iraq, and he's in a combat zone. They're driving down these roads. They're internal, they're improvised explosive devices, IEDs, and he experiences the horrors of war. Now, did you ever know anyone who had a similar experience?
Yes, I talked for doing the research. I talked to a lot of veterans, so I heard a lot of these stories and listened to their voices, watched their faces, came to understand what these experiences were like. There were also a lot of testimonies that were given about the war experience in Iraq, and there were a lot of videos that were made that you could watch. A lot of the soldiers in Iraq would write home and ask their parents for baby cams, which they would put on their helmets, and they would turn those on when they went out on patrol. So you could see exactly what it was like to drive down the streets of Ramadi and be in a firefight.
Now, not all Iraq veterans came back suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, did they? But some did. Did you talk to any who were victims of PTSD?
Yes, I did.
And about their experiences?
Yes.
And were they being treated successfully, or were they in quite a quandary as they
the symptoms vary enormously. A lot of the vets that I talked to didn't say specifically that they had that, but clearly they were suffering from psychological distress because of their experience. And some of them were treated, some were not treated, some were recovering without treatment, and some were suffering horribly. The VA system is extremely large and bureaucratic. It's not made up of people who don't want to help, but it's so cumbersome and so complicated that a lot of people do not get the help that they need.
Now, we are seeing almost a genre of novels about young men with PTSD. I mean, notable among them is Corrosion by John Bassoff. I don't know whether you know it, but are you aware of this? I mean, were you conscious of this as you wrote, that this was a subject that was intriguing other novelists who had lived through the experience we all lived through with the war in Iraq?
It is a hugely powerful presence for every vet that I talk to. Everyone knows about it. Nobody knows exactly what the numbers are, but they're huge, that very many of the vets have been affected in some way or other. Whether or not they've been officially diagnosed, they feel it. When I was writing the book, I was aware that the arc of writing about, the genre arc of writing about war follows a particular route. And so the first things that you hear about war, the first things that are written come from journalists. The next things are first-person narratives, memoirs who come from returning vets. The last thing that appears is fiction. So it was 10 years before there was any fiction that came out about this war. So I was working during that time. I knew it was coming, but I had no idea what direction it was going to go in. My book came out last summer, and I think there were only 2 novels that came out before that, the preceding fall.
Now, Conrad, as you draw the character, comes back, and he's constantly, a la Fitzgerald, drawn back into his past in Iraq. He walks down the street and he sees a woman with a bottle of water, and he thinks, my gosh, I'm being threatened in some way, or he's jostled in a restaurant, and he thinks it's an attack on his person. He has a difficult time reintegrating into the society at large, and also reintegrating with his family, his parents, his girlfriend, and his siblings, and feels alienated, and he seeks help. And one of the horrendous incidents that you recount is his experience at a VA hospital. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Well,
as I say, there were some people who were treated by the VA and had a successful experience, but it's very slow, and many, many people are told they have to wait for months, or they are turned away altogether, or they are treated very briefly and without appropriate depth. And that's very, very common. I talked to a lot of people and I read a lot of accounts about their experiences. And the VA last spring released figures that said that there were 22 suicides a day of vets. That's 8,000 deaths a year. And they said that they were aware that they were...
Vets from Iraq?
Well, it's actually all vets from all wars. So it includes Vietnam.
Vietnam as well.
But it's, I think it's mostly Iraq War veterans. And the number is probably larger than that because there are deaths that are not necessarily called suicides, but are drug overdoses and things like that. So the VA said that it was going to take steps to better its system, and they said that they had a very antiquated computer system. They had two systems that didn't interface, and they were taking steps to correct that, and they hope to have things made better by 2015, which is a pretty terrible thing to hear from for the vets.
Particularly when you think of this vet, Aaron Alexis, who had sought help in a VA hospital and really didn't get anything, and he shot up the Washington Navy Yard and killed a score or more of people.
That is a particularly terrible story, but there are lots of stories that we don't hear about of vets who seek help, are turned away, or they're given drugs that are inappropriate and they die, and their parent, I mean, there's stories in which the parents bring the son in and say, he is on suicide watch, please take him in and make sure he's safe. And the VA has released him, and he's been dead within 24 hours, or they give him drugs that have react badly with each other. So it's not a system that works well for everybody.
Well, and there's kind of a mini triage that exists. Conrad, in your book, was asked whether he thinks he might be harmful to himself or other people, and he says, not other people. And they said, oh, well, then you can come back in 6 months and, instead of 3 months. If you're harmful to other people, you come back a little sooner.
Exactly.
I mean, it's appalling, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, Conrad's mother was a psychotherapist, and you have a relatively affluent middle-class family. They were in a position to get him private help, but he doesn't seek it in the book. Is there some reason for that?
Yeah, it's very common. Veterans don't want to talk to civilians. And I've had a number of readers, mothers, say that would never have happened. She would have insisted that he get help. But first of all, you don't insist to a 26-year-old Marine lieutenant that he do anything, no matter who you are. But secondly, there's a very powerful internal resistance on the part of most people in the military against talking to people in the civilian world and asking for help. It goes against all their training and all their sort of interior commitment and beliefs. So the last thing he would have done was go to a civilian therapist.
Let's talk about the woman of the piece, the leading woman, Claire, who waits for him for 4 years while he's in Iraq. And you're a little ambivalent about how faithful she's been, at least in the physical sense, but certainly in terms of her affection for him. So she's kind of a latter-day Spartan Helen of Troy. And she waits for him, and he comes back, and he's damaged. He's severely damaged. He's damaged in his outlook, and he's damaged in his attitude toward her. Why does she hang around? Semper Fidelis?
Well, it's partly that. I mean, they took up together in college, and then he went in right after college, and she went on to another life. And he did come home once or twice between deployments, but honestly, I don't think since they weren't married, I don't think she would have stayed completely connected to him for those 4 years. But she loved him and was very close to him and was close to his family, so certainly didn't want to just drop him. She felt a very strong feeling of commitment and loyalty to him. But once she realized how damaged he was and how scary he was, he actually frightened her. And she really didn't know how to deal with him. And she didn't think he was getting better. So she tried for quite a while to connect to him and to help him move on, and he really resisted. So she finally said, I just don't know how to do this. I don't know how to go on. I can't go on.
Now, have you known a woman like this?
No, she's fictional. Everyone is fictional. This is a made-up.
But is it a composite? Do you draw on people you know for certain aspects of the personality?
I draw on people I know, and I think about what it would be like to be her, to be 22 years old and have a boyfriend who's going to be gone for 4 years in a life that you can't connect to. If she had been married to him, it would have been one thing. But it's very unusual for college kids to get married now at 22. They don't. They don't get married till they're in their late 20s. And at that point in her life, she wouldn't have stayed committed to somebody unless she'd been married to him. But she would have stayed committed because they wrote to each other and because they loved each other. She stayed connected to him. And she would have stayed closer to him if he hadn't been so strange when he came back. But he began to act in ways that she didn't understand and that frightened her.
Well, of course, he was a great admirer of the Spartans. He wrote his senior thesis at Williams on Sparta. And that would have implicated a strength of character and grit that he didn't seem, as with the Marine Corps ethos, they didn't seem to have.
You know, war can even break Marines. Marines take their own lives. They're part of this horrible epidemic. And for them, it's almost the worst because they do have such a strong ethos of grit and determination. But if the trauma is too great, they can't withstand it. So he was stuck.
Well, it's perfectly marvelous as you describe what was going on in his head, and the reader kind of gets inside the soul of Conrad. I mean, you write that, quote, what he felt, the symptoms was exactly what he did not want to describe or think about, the way things turned suddenly dark, the thundering rage or the avalanche of terror that swept over him, the crumbling free fall of shame, the floor dropping away, the feeling of disconnection and isolation. None of those things he could control. It was beautiful prose, but it's so descriptive of what was going on with him. And you do it so beautifully. So from what source did you pull all that? Or was it, tell us about your process of writing. How do you, I mean, did you just sit down at a typewriter or a computer and figure all that out?
When I write a novel, when I write fiction, I need to find a way inside a character, and then I really do need to inhabit that character. I need to know what everything in that person's life is like. And the way I found to Conrad's character was through his literary interests and his intellectual life, and that was something, and that's a very strong presence in the Marines. There are a lot of people there who were scholars. So that was something that allowed me to enter into his world. And then I drew on communities that I know and people that I know, people his age, and I became more and more certain of who he was, and the more I knew him, the more I inhabited his world. And so I really lived in his mind for the last 3 years of that book.
Lived in his mind. Now, was there something about the war in Iraq that produced so many cases of PTSD? People came back from World War II, and many of them were shell shock. We used to hear about shell shock, which I guess was PTSD before we knew about it, or cataloged it quite the same way. But do you feel it had to do, and does this enter into it, the fact that it was kind of a bankrupt mission?
There were a lot of cases of shell shock after World War II. It sort of overwhelmed the public health system at that time too. But all wars are unique. They change because of all sorts of things. But so Iraq is different from all the other wars that we have fought in. But it's a very strange war for many reasons, and one is that because it's against insurgents, because there is no territory that they defended, because there's no fort, there are no barracks, there's no terrain that our soldiers could could take hold of.
And no one found any weapons of mass destruction.
There were certainly no weapons of mass destruction, but even once we were there, for whatever reason we were there was no place to go. There was no city to take over. There was nothing. So what our troops were doing was simply being commanded to drive around on patrol over these roads studded with IEDs until they were blown up. There was no one to shoot at. It wasn't like two sets of tanks approaching each other across no man's land. It wasn't ever like that. It was called MOUT, which is military operations in urban terrain, which means fighting in a city. It was all MOUT. So they were driving down streets among civilians. The insurgents walked through the marketplace among children, among women. They concealed themselves. They didn't wear uniforms so there was no one for our troops to focus on. There was nobody to call the enemy.
No one to call the enemy. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but this has been absolutely marvelous. And I just want to thank you so much for coming by.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
And telling us about the book, and which I certainly recommend to everyone. It's very hard to put it down.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. Please visit our website at www.digitalage.org. For Conversations in the Digital Age, I am Jim Zirin. Good night and all the best.